Hello, ESA. My name's Holly Kirk, and I'm a member of the Interdisciplinary Conservation Science Group at RMIT University. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Whadjuk Noongar country over in Perth, Western Australia. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this work takes place, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So cities are growing and increasing in size and concentration, and they're also growing on areas that have naturally high levels of biodiversity. Not only does this make cities an obvious place to focus conservation efforts, but cities are also home to a large number of threatened species. Urban biodiversity in cities is also vital for human well-being, and by enabling everyday access to nature within urban areas, it may better allow people to connect with nature, helping to foster positive connections with the natural world. Urban areas are hotspots for biodiversity. However, they're also places where space and money are at an absolute premium. Working in urban biodiversity conservation can be a bit depressing, as evidenced by this aerial photo of a part of Perth. But the good news is that urban professionals and people like urban planners in local government, landscape architects, developers, they also think that the way that urban greenfield development is happening right now in Australia is also depressing, boring, destructive. We asked a group of our stakeholders at a workshop to describe how they describe current urban development, and these are the words that they used. However, the really good news is that they also really value urban nature or urban biodiversity. And these are the words that same set of urban professionals they used to describe what nature meant to them during the COVID lockdown. So escape, respite, peace and hope, sanctuary. So it's clear that everyday nature in urban areas is really important, but how can we achieve that for people, and how can we achieve really good conservation for our precious urban biodiversity? It's a wicked and complex problem, and clearly the way that we do urban development needs to change. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we might be able to do that using the biodiversity sensitive urban design framework, the work that we're doing at the moment to mainstream BSUD, including understanding barriers to that mainstreaming across disciplines. And in particular, a small research question we're investigating now, which is, does taking part in the BSUD process actually increase enthusiasm for biodiversity actions, again, across those different disciplines? So what is BSUD? Just very briefly, because I would encourage you to go and read the paper by my colleague Georgia Garrard, but essentially it's a framework that's designed to create urban areas that have a net benefit for native species and ecological communities. And we do this through the provision of essential resources, such as food and shelter, and the mitigation of key threats. So essentially going back to the ecology of a species for in that site. There are some 5 key principles, which you can see there. And it's a framework with 5 different steps. And these are designed to map onto the kind of key elements of the urban design process. So we've been really lucky to secure funding from the Ian Potter Foundation to investigate how we can mainstream BSUD, essentially try to make it business as usual in the way that we do urban development. We have 2 really great industry partners to help us do this, who are providing case studies for us to apply the BSUD process. One is Lendlease developers in Australia. They're working at a site called Averley in Greater Melbourne, and the other Yarra Valley Water, who own a site that they're going to develop again in Greater Melbourne called Hazelwind. So how do we mainstream BSUD? We're trying to, as part of our research, identify the challenges that are involved with this using our case studies, implement a set of best practice guidelines, provide some evidence of impact. So that's not just for its positive effects on biodiversity, but also the positive effects on people, and also create some communications and training, because what we'd like to do is be able to set BSUD free so that everyone who's involved in urban development at all different levels can use it in their work. So what are the barriers? Some of the barriers to mainstreaming BSUD, we've started to encounter some of these now in our work with both of our industry partners. There are conceptual barriers, things like language or understanding of sort of key concepts, but also perceptions around, what is urban nature and what does it need to look like. There are institutional barriers, so particularly the planning system, also maintenance systems existing in local council, and there are key implementation barriers as well. So things like materials, the cost of actually doing something that's a little bit different. Today, I'm going to focus a bit more on those conceptual barriers. And this particular research nugget came about from our work we did at Fisherman's Bend, a really huge urban renewal project in the heart of Melbourne, where we applied the BSUD framework. And it was during our workshop discussions at Fisherman's Bend that we realized that by involving a really diverse set of stakeholders in the creation of biodiversity objectives, we were actually creating a set of people who would go on and advocate very strongly for those biodiversity objectives at later points in time during the planning process. And so this led us to wonder, does taking part in a BSUD workshop actually help overcome some of these conceptual barriers? And so these BSUD workshops are a key part of our workflow in applying BSUD. Essentially, we have them with local stakeholders. These are a diverse set of people from local government, state government, traditional owners, the developers themselves, consultants such as landscape architects, actual architects, ecological consultants, and also local land care and conservation groups. And the idea of the workshop is to create and agree on a set of broad human-centric biodiversity objectives. They help to aid the understanding of how biodiversity requirements can align with those of the actual development. And we achieve those through a set of visioning exercises. So we conducted twice now with 2 different workshops at our 2 different case study sites in Greater Melbourne. We conducted pre and post workshop surveys. We basically asked participants to answer the same questions before and after the workshop. Some of the questions we asked were, how compatible is the inclusion of nature with other urban development objectives? So things like livability, affordability, various other kinds of, some of the things that people might think were perhaps in conflict with biodiversity. And for example, we asked them what are the main obstacles that might hinder the inclusion of nature or biodiversity in urban planning. So those were things like whether or not there were institutional issues. And so we asked these questions before and after, and we also asked some questions in our online survey, trying to measure each individual's underlying levels of optimism and risk aversion. And those survey answers were linked together. So we've run 2 workshops, like I said, and here are some very preliminary results. And the anti-Twitter badge in the corner isn't really because these are super secret, but more just because I caveat this is very initial, early kind of looking at our data that we just collected a few months ago. And, we've been really busy and it's nice to present something new, but also, finite amounts of time. So anyway, what you can see here is the proportion of respondents that answered to that 5-point Likert scale: strongly disagree to strongly agree. The statement, it is easy to include provisions for nature/biodiversity in urban developments. Now, what you can see is before the workshop and after the workshop, there's a slight shift towards more people agreeing that it's easy to include provisions, which is great. However, the caveat is that within there are sort of repeat answers from individuals, but that's actually one of the strengths of this piece of work, is that we can look at how individuals' opinions are changing between the before and after. So these questions were literally asked the day before, and then the second survey was given to participants later that day. And what you can see is that some people did actually change their answers, although not perhaps always in the way that we might expect. And obviously this is a very small sample size. This is just one of the questions. So their sentiments shifted. And we did ask an array of questions. So some of those were linked to barriers, some of those were linked to areas of potential conflict. And I think what we will be doing next with this data is a bit more of a comprehensive analysis. It's a small data set. So ideally, what I'm planning to do is combine all those responses to all questions and encoding whether the change in answer is negative or positive, or maybe not at all, and then include some of those covariates about people's existing levels of risk averseness or connection to nature. We also collected some more reflective answers from our participants and also from our facilitators on the day, which will be used to reflect on how well the workshops went. Did we actually achieve what we set out to do? Did people enjoy the visioning exercises, or did they think it was a load of rubbish? And ideally, it might be great to collect a little bit more data. So we're, hopefully going to gain some more case studies as we're working through this piece of research. It would be good to have some different development types, because greenfield development is very different to development that takes place infill or on an urban renewal site. And it would be good to make sure that we're covering off on a bunch of different disciplines, so different people and different from different fields who are actually working in urban development. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Thanks to my really amazing co-authors, and also to our key supporters from Yarra Valley Water, Lend-Lease, and also GHD. And lastly, just to leave you with a slide. So please, if you want to find out more, head over to our BSUD webpage, which will actually soon hopefully be updated with lots more resources. And also you can read about how we use the BSUD framework in Fisherman's Bend, which is sort of its first real life application. Thanks so much. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you. Bye.